All right, so we're doing our first week of 3 on Nietzsche. So we're going to start with the early Nietzsche today. We're going to do the birth of tragedy. We'll have a little piece of still early Nietzsche next time on truth and lie in an extra-moral sense, but then we'll be getting into the late Nietzsche with the genealogy of morals, and then finally the case of Wagner. So, anyone wants to volunteer for next time on the genealogy of morals, a polemic? Okay, that's one. Can I have a second? Great. Okay, great. So this is probably one of the most well-read, widely read texts by Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals. Birth of Tragedy may be a close second. I mentioned that we're going to have music as a example, as a phenomenon to consider. So we were just watching the Isolde's Liebestod, the climax of Tristan and Isolde, which would be a kind of classic example of the kind of music by Wagner that Nietzsche has in mind when he talks about the rebirth of tragedy. Right, so just what we read for today, the birth of tragedy, the birth and death of tragedy, the birth, death, and potential rebirth of tragedy. So let me just give some historical background for Nietzsche for our purposes. I mentioned that between Hegel and Nietzsche, we're kind of jumping over a historical interval that's significant. So we've been tracking with Kant Schiller and Hegel so far. Classicism to Romanticism. Now we're getting into modernism. So we're finally getting into the central topic of the course, the philosophy of modernism. And modernism is a circa 1848 phenomenon. So now with respect to modernism, we've already addressed Baudelaire a little bit. Baudelaire is deeply influential for Nietzsche, especially his later writings, his kind of aphoristic writings, but generally Baudelaire is influential for Nietzsche. A contemporary of Baudelaire, who is going to be a central character in all 3 major readings we're going to read from Nietzsche: Birth of Tragedy, Genealogy of Morals, and the case of Wagner is Wagner. And Wagner is the first modernist in music. So we'll see in 2 weeks when we read the case of Wagner, Nietzsche will refer to Wagner as part of the generation of 1848. So Baudelaire would be a member of the generation of 1848. Wagner, member of the generation of 1848. So is Marx. So I mentioned that there are 2 characters in the course who are kind of very present absences on our syllabus, Baudelaire and Marx. So they are also, along with Wagner, members of the generation of 1848. What is the significance of that? So 1848 is the year of the spring of the peoples, or the spring of the nations. It's the revolutions of 1848. takes place throughout Europe, but with central events taking place in France especially, but also in Germany. So in France, it overthrows the July monarchy that had come to power in the Revolution of 1830 and brings about what's known as the Second Republic. Second Republic because the First Republic was in the First French Revolution of 1789. So just to sort of round this out, we've got the American and French revolutions at the end of the 18th century. We have in France the First Republic, in retrospect, but also the First Empire. That's Napoleon. We have the Restoration after the defeat of Napoleon. Then we have the July Revolution in monarchy coming out of 1830, the July 1830 Revolution, the July monarchy. And then the revolutions of 1848. And in France, we get the Second Republic and the Second Empire following the Second Republic with Louis Bonaparte, who's the nephew of Napoleon. So he becomes the emperor of the Second Empire, who's Napoleon III. We'll see why that's important in a minute. So Wagner is an active participant in the German Revolution. He is a Cutronian anarchist socialist, Wagner. He's influenced by Pierre Joseph Proudhon, who's the inventor of anarchism. He's the most prominent, really the most prominent socialist in the world in the 1840s, and certainly the most prominent socialist in France in the 1840s. Baudelaire is an apolitical. Marx, of course, is a member of the Communist League, for which he and his buddy wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1840, and they participated in the revolution of 1848 as well. Baudelaire is more kind of a side commentator on the French Revolution of 1848. And Baudelaire is also a personal acquaintance, as is Marx, of Proudhon. Marx and Engels are living in Paris in the lead up to the 1848 revolution in the 1840s. So it's a bohemian milieu. Bohemian. It's an avant-garde milieu. So the bohemian and avant-garde milieus. The avant-garde is associated with 1848. Bohemia is associated with the Restoration era in the early 19th century. So you get the term Bohemia from the province of Bohemia in Central Europe, where, so why does Bohemia get the name from the place? Because it refers to the political and cultural refugees, exiles, from the post-French Revolution reaction, from the Restoration. So the people who are too liberal or radical, whether culturally or politically, to stay in Central, Eastern Europe. And so they flee to Bohemia, immigrant communities, refugee communities in Paris, London, New York, etc. And so Marx and Engels are Bohemians in that respect. They're political exiles in Western Europe, and they go eventually to the UK. Marx goes to London. They almost made it all the way to the United States. They were going to go to the United States with this thing. A lot of people from refugees from 1848, the 48ers, not only settle in Bohemia, but also there's massive immigration to the United States out of Europe in the wake of 1848 revolutions. So it's a major event that is now kind of obscure. The revolutions of 1848 are, from Marx's perspective, they're the first revolutions that take place in the era of capitalism. The reason for that is that capitalism is associated with the Industrial Revolution, which is conventionally dated, the first Industrial Revolution that is, from 1750 to 1850. First in the UK, then in France as a function of the French Revolution and the countries neighboring France, like the Netherlands, Belgium, and also the western part of Germany, the Rhineland, where Marx and Engels are from, for example. So it's the first set of revolutions in the era of capitalism. The socialist and communist movement, these were terms that were used interchangeably, and I mentioned Cutrone, anarchism that influenced Wagner. They're a new movement coming out of the Industrial Revolution, that era, and Marx and Engels didn't invent socialism or communism. They're kind of minor characters in a much broader movement at this time in 1848. Okay, so we're jumping over this interval of history. I put in 1830 there only because it will become significant when we get past Nietzsche to Lukács, to the theory of the novel, and the issue of realism. So we've dealt with classicism, romanticism, now modernism, circa 1848. There's also a parallel development out of romanticism that's associated more with the 1830s, and that is realism. And we will see later, when we get to Adorno, that this 20th century, early mid-20th century conflict between realism and modernism has its roots in this earlier history. Okay. Now Nietzsche, so we're jumping over this whole 1830 to 1870-71 epoch. From the July Revolution around the time of Hegel's death to the Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune at the end of that war, which is the formative experience for Nietzsche as a young man. So he served in the military briefly during the Franco-Prussian War. I mentioned Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon III attacked Germany, was defeated. Germany occupied France. German unification was effected through this victory over France by the Prussian Empire. And the Kaiser was crowned Emperor of Germany, or really the Prussian Empire, Germany under Prussian control, at Versailles. At Versailles. Nietzsche got sick while he was in the military. He was like a medical orderly. He got sick. He crashed out, and he was in part sickened. We'll see. He uses this language of like bodily illness and nausea and digestive troubles and intestinal difficulties. Very like physical language to talk about his thought, his feeling, his experience. He was sickened by the German triumphalism in the Franco-Prussian War. And the Kaiserreich that was established as a function of victory in the Franco-Prussian War. He's very negative about Bismarck and Bismarckism and Prussianism and imperialism. So we have Russian Empire, we have the Second Empire, this is where we get the term imperialism. The term imperialism, whether used in a Marxist context or in a more general political science context. Imperialism refers to the French Second Empire and to the German Kaiserreich, the Prussian Empire. It also refers to other things, of course, the British Empire, but really the term comes with this era of the late 19th century. Okay, so Nietzsche. He's bringing us into the era of modernism originates with Baudelaire circa 1848. Nietzsche's bringing us into the period of high modernism, which is associated with the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. So the era after the Franco-Prussian War, before World War I. Before World War I and the revolutions that come out of World War I. The Russian Revolution most prominently. And high modernism, we would see this exemplified by the Armory Show in New York, 1913. And so this language has shifted a bit after the 1960s, and in the era of postmodernism in particular, such that high modernism is transposed into the mid-20th century, and it's sort of institutionalized modernism, like MoMA, Museum of Modern Art modernism. That's not. That's already postmodernism. It's already maybe late modernism. It's already the dawn of postmodernism with pop art, post-abstract expressionism, Rauschenberg, Johns, all that good stuff. And also John Cage, who we'll talk about later. We'll come back to music with Adorno. So high modernism, pre-World War I, late modernism after World War I, also the 20th century avant-garde that emerges in World War I and flourishes after World War I. So Nietzsche's bringing us into the era of high modernism. And this would be, for instance, the painters that we associate with modernism. Van Gogh, Matisse, Monet. Cubism was the end of this period, so kind of early Picasso as opposed to post-World War I late Picasso. So, mentioned in Nietzsche, formative experience, Franco-Prussian War. Nietzsche is the product of a romantic education, of a kind of institutionalized romanticism in the 19th century, specifically as a classical philologist. That's how he's trained. He's trained as a scholar of ancient languages. He and his friends, his cohort, his colleagues, so he studies more typically Greek and Latin, but he has close personal acquaintances, friends, colleagues who study Arabic, Sanskrit, Hebrew, everything. So they have this kind of world view of classical philology, history of language as some kind of marker for the history of society, culture, we'll see history of psychology. Later on. So he is trained in ancient literature and in the history. The shifts, changes in classical antiquity that are marked by changes in language, but also in artistic forms. So this work that we read for today, The Birth of Tragedy, is his first big splash major work, major publication. And so it has a lot of fireworks. He's trying to impress people. He's a real person. So definitely super enthusiastic, high in his own supply, for sure. This is where he's coming from. So Romanticism, which is very much concerned with history, with difference, with historical difference, with cultural difference, and nuances of difference across historical time and across cultures. We're going to be so the early Nietzsche, 1870s, late Nietzsche, 1880s. So it's a pretty short career that we'll be tracing, but nonetheless, there is a shift that takes place. And the early Nietzsche, as he himself talks about, he's befriended by, taken under the wing of Wagner as a kind of mentor to him, but also he's very much influenced by Schopenhauer, the philosopher Schopenhauer, who was maybe the most famous philosophical critic of Hegel. And so Schopenhauer and Hegel taught at the same university in Berlin, and Schopenhauer, they're down the hall from each other, and Schopenhauer is telling the students, I don't know what the hell Hegel is teaching down the hall, but it's not philosophy. Now, Hegel does enjoy a certain kind of institutionalization in the 1800s, so we did Hegel last time. And there's a famous split among Hegel's students, among the Hegelians, among the young Hegelians. It can be characterized in two different ways. It can be characterized as young Hegelians versus old Hegelians. It can also be characterized as left Hegelians versus right Hegelians. So the old Hegelians and the right Hegelians sort of prevail in an institutional context, in official academia. And the young Hegelians and the left Hegelians, in some ways the only real left Hegelians actually are Marx and Engels themselves. But the young Hegelians, they think of themselves as revolutionaries. Many of them identify as socialists or communists, and they try to take Hegel's philosophy in a politically radical and revolutionary direction, whereas the right Hegelians or the old Hegelians basically adopt Hegel as a philosophical justification for the world as it is. And because of that presence of Hegel, Nietzsche has a bad association. We'll see. Also with Kant. We kind of get all thrown in there. So we talked about the 25 years of philosophy, Kant inventing philosophy and Hegel completing philosophy. Nietzsche is very negative about that. So let's see how Nietzsche introduces his own work. What's this? Table of contents. No table of contents. So we have to introduce this Birth of Tragedy. We have a preface written by Nietzsche himself. But let's pause on the various titles given to this work. So the later edition, for which he wrote the self-critical preface, is titled The Birth of Tragedy, or Hellenism and Pessimism. So Hellenism refers to kind of Greekism, Hellas, Greece, Hellenism, and pessimism. And we'll come back to the attempted self-criticism. But then the original title, when first published, is The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. Okay, so I mentioned Nietzsche himself as a musician. He's a musician, he's a composer even. We have two musicians, composers, on the syllabus, namely Nietzsche and Adorno. And our first reading from Adorno will be alongside the case of Wagner. It will be Adorno's criticism of Nietzsche on Wagner, and also on Carmen, on the opera Carmen. Here's the later, so this is representative of the later Nietzsche, looking back on his earlier work, attempt at a self-criticism. Whatever may be at the bottom of this questionable book, it must have been an exceptionally significant and fascinating question, and deeply personal at that. The time in which it was written, in spite of which it was written, bears witness to that, the exciting time of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. As the thunder of the Battle of Worth was rolling over Europe, the muser and riddle friend, who was to be the father of this book, sat somewhere in an alpine nook, very bemused and beriddled, hence very concerned and yet unconcerned, and wrote down his thoughts about the Greeks, the core of the strange and almost inaccessible book to which this belated preface or postscript shall now be added. A few weeks later, and he himself was to be found under the walls of Metz, still wedded to the question marks that he had placed after the alleged cheerfulness of the Greeks and of Greek art. Eventually, in that month of profoundest suspense, when the peace treaty was being debated at Versailles, he too attained peace with himself, and slowly convalescing from an illness contracted at the front, completed the final draft of The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. Out of music, music and tragedy, Greeks, and the music of tragedy, Greeks, and the art form of pessimism, the best turned out, most beautiful, most envied type of humanity to date, those most apt to seduce us to life, the Greeks. How now? They of all people should have needed tragedy. Even more, art? For what? Greek art. You will guess where the big question mark concerning the value of existence has thus been raised. Is pessimism necessarily a sign of decline, decay, degeneration, weary and weak instincts, as it once was in India and now is, to all appearances among us, modern men and Europeans? Is there a pessimism of strength, an intellectual predilection for the hard, gruesome, evil, problematic aspect of existence, prompted by well-being, by overflowing health, by the fullness of existence? Is it perhaps possible to suffer precisely from overfullness? The sharp-eyed courage that tempts and attempts, that craves the frightful as the enemy, the worthy enemy against whom one can test one's strength, from whom one can learn what it means to be frightened. What is the significance of the tragic myth among the Greeks of the best, the strongest, the most courageous period, and the tremendous phenomenon of the Dionysian, and born from it tragedy? What might they signify? And again, that of which tragedy died, the Socratism of morality, the dialectics, frugality, and cheerfulness of the theoretical man. How now? Okay, so this is really the core issue. The core issue is, why is tragedy the highest artistic achievement of the greatest period of ancient Greek civilization. Now, he's in dialogue, as we'll see, with Aristotle. Aristotle, who theorized tragedy. And for Nietzsche, the theorization of tragedy, the philosophization of tragedy, marks the end of tragedy, the death of tragedy, as a living art form. So what happened in ancient Greece is that tragedy died out and was replaced by comedy. Now, comedy doesn't mean ha-ha comedy. Comedy means drama, plays that are about human affairs, that are about politics, society. Tragedy, of course, is about the gods. It's about divine fate, the gods. So he associates the emergence of philosophy, which actually predates this moment, but philosophy as we now understand philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. The Socrates we get from Plato. Plato and Aristotle as the founders of philosophy. He associates philosophy with the end of something. So we talked about this with Hegel, the phases of the appearance of Geist or spirit or mind or consciousness, of freedom, religion, art, philosophy. Right, so I mentioned that the sequence recurs several times. So once in classical antiquity, you could say it's also repeated by the Romans after the Greeks. Then European civilization per se, medieval Christendom, the Renaissance, and then finally the Enlightenment. Right, so the sequence of religion becoming art, becoming philosophy, and he's focused on that transition from art to philosophy. Hegel addressed it in the reading last week in terms of Romanticism. The Romanticism marked the end of classicism. It marked a certain end of art and its succession by philosophy. So what did that mean? It didn't mean that people stopped making art by any means. What it meant was that art needed philosophy in order to be itself, in order to make sense. Now, one of the things that is ironical for Nietzsche is that he was celebrating in The Birth of Tragedy, the original book, what he saw as the rebirth of tragedy or the rebirth of art, as opposed to theoretical man or philosophical man. But he himself was doing a philosophical interpretation of just that, of Wagner. And by the way, Wagner did not take Nietzsche's view of his work seriously, either positively or negatively. So he was happy to have, a brilliant young writer who was championing his music, but Wagner himself had a little bit of intellectual contempt and also musical contempt for Nietzsche. So part of what we're going to be tracing over these 3 weeks of Nietzsche is Nietzsche's revision of his original idea. So his original idea was that there's a kind of split between art and philosophy. Art versus philosophy. Philosophy Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and others. Art, in being displaced by philosophy, this tension between art and philosophy, is itself divided between Apollo and Dionysus. So we read in the first Friedrich class, the first day of class, the archaic torso of Apollo by Rilke. It's a turn of the century high modernist poet. And Apollo I mentioned is the god of form. So Apollo gives form to the world. He rides his chariot across the sky, shooting out rays of light that give form to things. He's the god of form. So then what is Dionysus? Right, so the split between art and philosophy also has something to do with the split between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And so kind of one-sided view of art presages a one-sided view of truth. So that's really the issue. The issue is the split in truth between art and philosophy. Or we could say between the subjective and the objective character of truth. So the theoretical man, philosophy, posits truth as objective, as outside of us. Whereas art posits truth as subjective. Truth is a matter of our subjective experience. Philosophy, theoretical man, and science places the truth outside of us and makes it objective.
At one point, I think maybe this is in the self-criticism.
Yeah.
He says you can't criticize science and live in science.
Right. So what he ends up doing actually is that he puts the late Nietzsche has a tripartite rather than a dichotomous division. And so basically he becomes more sympathetic to science and even more hostile to philosophy. So he starts off with this kind of art versus philosophy idea that also has science as collateral damage. The science is associated with theoretical man, objective truth, philosophy. But then he decides, the late Nietzsche decides, actually science is different from philosophy, and he respects science in a way that philosophy remains problematic. So the issue is whether this subjective versus objective truth holds or not. And so later Nietzsche thinks that unique opposition doesn't really hold. There might be different modes of truth, art, philosophy, science, but it's not parsable as subjective objective. Of course, all three domains involve the subjective and the objective. Let me start with Kant. What would Kant make of this split into the subjective and the objective? He would say it doesn't make sense. And it wouldn't make sense in any domain. It wouldn't make sense for philosophy to make that distinction, to oppose those things, the subjective and the objective. It wouldn't make sense for art or aesthetics to make that division. All right, so then what about Apollo and Dionysus? So if Apollo is about form giving, then Dionysus is what?
Form dissolution.
Yes.
And a reaccess of like a primal unity.
That's right. Right. So art is not just about giving form to things, but because it's about our experience of the form of things, it also involves the formless and the becoming formed and also the dissolving of form. So in the experience of art are both moments. The constitution of the subject and the dissolution of the subject. So the subject finds itself in the experience of the work of art, but also the subject loses itself in the experience of the work of art. All right, so we started with Isolde's Liebestod, the love death of Isolde, right? Because she is, basically singing herself to death out of complete devotion to Tristan, and she's becoming herself in dissolving herself, ending herself, and she's sort of describing this experience of kind of just sort of dissolving herself into the emanations of the cosmos through music, through singing. All right, so she becomes herself in terms of this is the essence of her character, but in that moment of losing herself, sacrificing herself. And that brings us around to the Dionysian. So Nietzsche has what might appear to be a quirky kind of history of the tragedy art form of drama, but in fact is borne out by a lot of evidence. Namely, that tragedy as a stage play drama art form started out as more of a religious ritual. So there was a kind of Dionysian ritual, a religious ritual that became a kind of proto-art form, the satyr play, and then that ultimately became tragedy. So the Dionysian ritual itself, originally, was a human sacrifice. It was a kind of an orgiastic, collective, effervescent, communal experience that resulted in human sacrifice. It then became a kind of virtual sacrifice, meaning the tragic hero, the hero who meets a tragic fate in the play, in tragedy, is experiencing that sacrifice. So Aristotle, fill in a little bit what Nietzsche is arguing against. So Aristotle's theory of tragedy starts with a very basic question that we may not even tend to consider. We might just overlook, jump past, but we really need to start there. Why would people take pleasure in watching a painful spectacle, namely the tragic fate of a hero? Especially because, so we all know, like, tragic flaw, the protagonist, the hero with the tragic flaw. Actually, the tragic flaw is inseparable from the virtue of the hero, meaning the hero suffers and dies, suffers the tragic fate because of their virtue, as a punishment of the gods. So the gods, who are jealous of humans, punish virtuous humans. Right? That's what tragedy is about. It's about the strong, the beautiful, the intelligent, the cunning, the heroic being brought down by the gods, being punished for their virtues. So Why would we find this an appealing art form? Why would we take pleasure in that? So Aristotle's theory, we could say, his philosophy, it's actually a psychology. And this is why Nietzsche will eventually say he's not a philosopher, he's a psychologist. Maybe philosophers are just psychologists, more generally, and that they just puff up their psychology into a philosophy. The theory is that in order to deal with the existential dread, the terror of human existence, we need to be able to purge our negative emotions. So in order not to live constantly in a state of anxious terror and dread at our vulnerability and mortality, which we're aware of, the animals are not. The animals don't know that they can die. We know that we can die, and so therefore we live in constant dread of that eventuality. Right? So we need to purge those negative emotions, otherwise we would just be a shambles, a total mess. We wouldn't be able to function. Catharsis. Yeah, purging the negative emotions, purging this existential terror, dread of existence. And we do that specifically by seeing the best destroyed. Right, so with sacrificial victims, with human sacrifice, which has been practiced in all sorts of cultures across history, across time, of course sacrificial victims were beautiful. That's what made them worthy to be sacrificial victims. They were like the best examples that were to be sacrificed from the community. Okay, now, again, Nietzsche thinks that Aristotle's theory that once the community, the Greeks, needed a philosopher to explain how and why tragedy worked, it's because it no longer really self-evidently did what it was supposed to do at an aesthetic level. That now it needed to be theorized. That one needed to describe experience more objectively. So one couldn't just have the subjective experience of watching the play, but one needed to treat one's own feelings, thoughts, experience objectively, as philosophy does. So that signals something. He doesn't think that Aristotle's wrong. He doesn't think Aristotle's wrong. But he does think that Aristotle marks a change, marks a transition, marks the end of something and the beginning of something else. And again, it's the birth of theoretical man. So theory, what does theory mean? So theory just means how we see things. It's like a vantage point, a view of things. So theoretical man is when we experience our existence by contemplating it, by looking at it, by examining it. Right, so there's a kind of a distance from ourselves that we have via philosophy, science, theory. That tends to emphasize the subject in a particular way, and it tends to make the meaning of existence hinge on our subjectivity. So it does tend to mean the repression of the Dionysian moment. The Dionysian moment in art, but the Dionysian moment more generally. The truth of Dionysus itself must be suppressed. But in doing that, we actually lose an ability to suffer. We lose an ability to suffer in a meaningful way. So the birth of theoretical man brings with it the danger that we will lose the ability to make sense of our suffering, to find our suffering meaningful. This attempt at self-criticism is from the later Nietzsche, so this is speaking from the perspective of Nietzsche's works that we'll read on the genealogy of morals in the case of Wagner. On the genealogy of morals, what we'll discuss next week, the issue is nihilism. Nihilism. Right, so unfortunately, Nietzsche gets tagged with what he's trying to diagnose. So if you ask like a theologian, Nietzsche, they'll be like, oh, he's a nihilist. No. He was trying to diagnose the symptom of nihilism. In other words, where does nihilism come from? What does it mean? And is nihilism the lack of meaning, or is it itself meaningful? Is nihilism itself meaningful? The early Nietzsche thinks that the nihilism of modernity is meaninglessness, right? So it's sort of about the absence of meaning. Next week, we will see that nihilism itself is meaningful. It's not just the absence of meaning, it itself has a meaning. Go ahead.
Isn't diagnosing it bringing it into existence and therefore creating it?
Yeah, you can't shoot the message.
But also making it into like, by bringing it into the realm of language and making it into an idea and therefore you can't shoot the message either.
You can shoot the message? Yeah, you can. Well, you don't speak of the devil or Peter? Yeah, I mean, look. Children, we live in a nihilistic world. Yes? Yeah, obviously. Come on.
But it's not, obviously it's not Nietzsche's fault.
Yeah, it's not Nietzsche's fault, but there are people who say that it's Nietzsche's fault. Yeah, the right one. The culture warriors, like the Christians. They're like, academia, you take a little bit of postmodernists. What do they mean by that? Nietzscheans. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. It is blank. Oh, yes. So don't shoot the messenger. Especially when he's telling the truth. All right, so can we handle the truth? What is the truth? That humans, part of our existence, is that we have to suffer with the threat of meaninglessness. According to Nietzsche. Right? And so everything that we do is an attempt to deal with that threat of meaninglessness. Right, so we did the three phases of the appearance of freedom, or mind, or consciousness, Hegel, religion, art, philosophy. Right, so those are the ways that our freedom appears to us. Now we're dealing with Nietzsche with the three ways that humans try to overcome the threat of meaninglessness. First religion, then art, and finally philosophy. So we try to overcome meaninglessness in these ways. The first attempt is through religion. Then when that wears thin, we attempt to deal with the threat of meaninglessness through art. But then that runs its course, and then finally we arrive at philosophy. And yet, ironically, philosophy is the least capable of giving us meaning of the three. I mean, religion gives us meaning least problematically. Art introduces a problem that, unbeknownst to itself, that is fully revealed in philosophy. And then philosophy, it's like, oh shit, wait. So what is theoretical man about it? Let's rehearse that. Theoretical man philosophy. What does theoretical man or philosophy privilege, value most of all? I mean, here we are, we're in the school of the Art Institute of Chicago. Why do artists need a school? Why can't they just make art? Why can't they just be trained by other artists?
Reason and structure?
Reason, for sure. Structure, yes. Some kind of a form, like a kind of logical form, like philosophy. You need knowledge. Knowledge. You need knowledge. You don't only need to know things, but you need knowledge. You need this thing called knowledge. Where do you find knowledge? Something like a library or a computer database. It's on the internet. It's on Google. You want to know something? Right? It's outside of us. Right? It's objective. Objective knowledge. Objective truth. It's like a thing, like a possession. Right? So, knowledge. Right? Theoretical man loves knowledge. Right, we'll see. What's the point of knowledge? What is knowledge for? Right, so we have a huge mass of data. We've got millions of books, millions of articles. We've got all sorts of scientific research going on. We've got a lot of generation of knowledge. Right, that's what academia is. It's like knowledge generation of knowledge, generation and warehousing, archiving of knowledge. What is it for? What does it mean? How does it give meaning to our existence? Does it give it any meaning?
Advanced goals that we call thinking.
Yeah, we might think so. We have paintings. We have books about paintings. So, we have knowledge, right? The museum across the street has inventory of artworks. They have artworks on the wall. They have artworks in storage. They have a library of paintings, basically. Is that knowledge? Does that count as knowledge? Or, you guys, as you heard the Art Institute, what's the ethos here? It might have dropped out of fashion. I don't know. Research. Your art is your research? No? Do they talk about that anymore? Okay, I hope
That
that's...
doesn't feel like Purdue, to me at least.
No, none of your
That's just
professors
me.
ever said, art is your form of research? You're undergrads. Some of you... Yeah, you've heard this, yeah. So maybe the grad students are more subject to this, and the undergrads not as much. I don't know. I don't know where this jargon, how it filters. No, your practice. What's your practice? But art and research. No, art is your research. No.
There's multiple forms of attaining knowledge.
Right. So the idea is that art is a form of attaining knowledge. Nietzsche's shrieking when he hears that. Right? Go ahead.
And he's in this cave.
Yeah, the cave paintings.
And then there's this cave painting that works violence. And then they're able to raise back the family painting to make so many thousand people. And then there was another painting over the original one painting, which was made 5,000 years later. It's still a that cave painting. And then at some point he just says you just can't comprehend this time that passed between these paintings, and for the last couple of years just being stuck in this room. And that's how I feel about with art and research also.
Right. In other words, what does a cave painting tell us about? What kind of knowledge does it give us about the past? Does it? What kind of knowledge does it give? Can it give us knowledge in the form of aesthetic experience? Or is that, is there kind of a subtle contradiction there? Or maybe it gives us the impossibility of experiencing what people back then experienced. Because we can't experience the cave painting.
So, is it reaching the sort of aesthetic
knowledge, but mostly we have a student of really helpful. Like,
It might
if
be,
there's those-
it might be capital K knowledge
Okay.
as opposed to small K
Okay.
knowledge. It's just a different kind of knowledge of philosophy and science. Right, so he thinks that what's happened is truth. Truth and knowledge are two different things. So knowledge is kind of objectified truth, we can call it that. But basically, truth has been hijacked by philosophy and science, by theoretical man, at the expense of art. So the truth of art has been sort of lost or suppressed, or leads this kind of subterranean underground existence. It's become obscured. And the artists have gone along with it too, in his view. Like in The Birth of Tragedy, the artists have been complicit in this because, again, their self-understanding, how they explain their own work to themselves, tends to be Apollonian and not Dionysian. I want to say something about the cheerfulness. So I mentioned nihilism, I mentioned suffering, so cheerfulness. So Nietzsche thinks that the Greeks suffered cheerfully, by contrast with us, who suffer morosely or morbidly. Right? So suffering cheerfully, what does that mean? Does it mean not having negative feelings? No.
By suffering, does he mean like the internal experience of thinking about it or feeling it, or the outward expression of catharsis?
Well, both. And also like bodily suffering, like physical suffering. Right? He thinks the Greeks suffered cheerfully, like they met death courageously, cheerfully. They weren't like cringing, morose, depressed about it. Right? They understood that to live is to suffer. To live is to suffer, children. To live is to suffer. Like, you cannot take suffering out of life. You cannot. Right? So, the only question is how we suffer, and tied to that, inseparably, is the meaning of our suffering. What are we suffering for?
So it gave them purpose, which resolved their sense of meaning.
So the Greeks suffered meaningfully, and therefore they suffered cheerfully. We suffer meaninglessly, and therefore morosely, morbidly, depressingly. Like, we can't find meaning in our suffering, so we try to avoid suffering, which is impossible because to avoid suffering means avoiding life. Can't avoid suffering if you're living. Right? So the Greeks knew that to live is to suffer, and they were able to make meaning out of their suffering, and therefore meaning in their life, in their existence, in their living. Whereas we, because we can't find meaning in suffering, we can't find meaning in life.
Well, we've renounced life to some extent.
We've renounced
in order not
life.
to suffer.
Absolutely.
Or we think of life as a mistake.
For sure. Definitely, that's true. Now, you know these maniacs, like the tech bros, like the search for immortality or whatever, like, and then they're going to upload their consciousness into the computer? Right? No, I mean, we're laughing, but these fuckers control everything. They're using us as guinea pigs in their experiments to achieve this. Every second of every fucking day. We're hamsters in their wheel. And what's worse is they think of themselves as Nietzschean. Oh, fuck. Nietzsche is rolling in his grave. Definitely a psychological case. It's definitely a psychological case. Okay. Pessimism. Pessimism, suffering, pessimism. So pessimism is, again, a function of the meaninglessness of suffering. Meaning, pessimism, now he talked about the pessimism of the strong, right? There's the pessimism of the weak, there's the pessimism of the strong. So what's the pessimism of the strong about with regard to cheerful suffering or cheerfulness in our suffering? We have to risk meaninglessness in order to achieve meaning. So we don't simply have meaning. That would be religion. That would be religion. And Nietzsche is never great on religion. He's never very positive about religion. So religion would just give us a kind of fixed meaning for suffering, and therefore not risk meaninglessness. Art, by comparison, however, risks the threshold of meaningfulness and meaninglessness. Art risks meaninglessness, and therefore risks pessimism. Right, so it's in our strength that we do things like make art, because we're risking meaninglessness in our suffering. We're taking that risk in a way that religion sort of settles the question a priori. Especially, we'll see, he's very negative about Christianity. Although we'll see, there's an interesting wrinkle to all that. Meaning when Christians become artists, then they become interesting. Raphael. Right, we'll look at the Raphael painting as an example of this. I want to say something because we didn't touch on it last time and I felt bad about it. Like immediately after class, I was like, oh no, we didn't deal with the irony in Hegel. We didn't deal with the problem of the irony in Hegel. It's very important with respect to Romanticism. So what made Romanticism modern for Hegel was tied to this question of art becoming ironical. So there's a difference between irony and cynicism.
Can you compare it to like the comic?
Possibly. What do you mean?
Like the ironic in the comics, or the ironic makes fun of this in the sense of like doesn't have a sense of self. Whereas the comic has like a structured sense of self.
Right. So the question for Hegel was, why had art become self-ironical?
Yeah.
And the meaning of that couldn't be simply accepted in its own terms, nor could it be sort of embraced as a principle, because Hegel thought to embrace irony as a principle in art would also mean embracing it as a principle of life. Right? And he saw in the Romantics that they did actually take it to that extent. And that was their attempt. He thought it was a symptom, Hegel thought that the ironical was a symptom of people trying to hold on to the self-evidence of art after it had passed. And so, therefore, what holding on to the self-evidence of art after it had passed is to hold on to the self-ironical character of art after it demanded interpretation. Right? So the Romantics tried to live their lives as if they were artworks, but as if they were ironical artworks. Right? So their irony with respect to art was also replicated in their irony at their own existence. And he thought that that was maybe a necessary transition, like a kind of moment of truth, but we couldn't sort of just land there. We couldn't end there. That instead we'd have to take up like the meaning of the irony. And again, for Hegel, it meant that art in its self-evident truth had passed. That art needed reflection, it needed criticism, history, philosophy, theory. It needed these things in order to make sense of itself. It couldn't be a self-evident aesthetic experience. It had to be conceptualized. It had to have this kind of moment, which the Romantics misinterpreted as an inherent irony of art, and therefore an inherent irony of life. So Nietzsche's returning to that problem. He's returning to that problem, right? But he is agreeing with Hegel, but he's changing its meaning. He's putting this twist on it. So he thinks the ironization of life comes from theoretical man, comes from the philosophical turn itself. So Socrates. Science itself, our science, indeed, what is the significance of all science viewed as a symptom of life? For what, worse yet, whence all science? How now? Is the resolve to be so scientific about everything perhaps a kind of fear of, an escape from pessimism? A subtle last resort against truth? And morally speaking, a kind of cowardice and falseness? Amorally speaking, a ruse, like a self-deception. O Socrates, Socrates, was that perhaps your secret? O enigmatic ironist, was that perhaps your irony? So Socrates, talk about knowledge and truth, but knowledge, meaning what did Socrates know? What was the truth of his knowledge? What did he know? He knew that he knew nothing. Right. But then that became the foundation for knowledge. And so what is that, according to Nietzsche? Does that mean that he was ironical about his own irony? Or was it a kind of ruse? Or was it a cowardice and falseness? Now this is the late Nietzsche speaking in his self-criticism, meaning in The Birth of Tragedy, he's kind of anti-Socrates. Here he's not. Right? The later Nietzsche is not so anti-Socrates. He's willing to say that, in fact, in rejecting Socrates in The Birth of Tragedy, he himself was avoiding something. Right? He himself was trying to uphold art against philosophy rather than getting at the truth of this division between art and philosophy and science. Really between art and science. That's what he's dealing with here, art and science. And then philosophy, we'll see, it makes a muddle of it. Makes a muddle of this problem. Okay. Let me... Alright, so he says, I do not want to suppress entirely how disagreeable it now seems to me, how strange it appears after 16 years, before a much older, 100 times more demanding, but by no means colder eye, which has not become a stranger to the task which this audacious book dared to tackle for the first time, to look at science in the perspective of the artist, but at art in that of life. So he's putting art as a kind of mediator between life and knowledge, life and objective truth. He says, to say once more today, I find it an impossible book. I consider it badly written, ponderous, embarrassing, image-mad and image-confused, sentimental, in places saccharine to the point of effeminacy, uneven in tempo, without the will to logical cleanliness, very convinced and therefore disdainful of proof, mistrustful even of the propriety of proof. A book for initiates, music for those dedicated to music, those who are closely related to begin with on the basis of common and rare aesthetic experiences, music meant as a sign of recognition for close relatives in artibus, an arrogant and rhapsodic book that sought to exclude right from the beginning the profane crowd of the educated, even more than the mass or the folk. Pardon me. All right, let's turn to your notes and see what you guys had to say about the preface before we turn to the main body of it. Did you guys talk about? Oh, you just talked about the main body of it. Okay, so let's get into the main body of it. He makes a lot of reference to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, both here and then we'll see it on the genealogy of morals. For some reason, Nietzsche thought that Thus Spoke Zarathustra was his essential work, was his main book. But then he's always explaining it in his other books. It may not have been his best book. Thus Spoke Zarathustra. All right. We shall have gained much for the science of aesthetics once we perceive not merely by logical inference, but with the immediate certainty of vision, the continuous development of art is bound up with the Apollonian and Dionysian duality. Just as procreation depends on the duality of the sexes, involving perpetual strife with only periodically intervening reconciliations. The terms Dionysian and Apollonian we borrow from the Greeks, who disclosed to the discerning mind the profound mysteries of their view of art, not to be sure in concepts, but in the intensely clear figures of their gods. Right, so the Apollonian and the Dionysian are not concepts. They're gods. Through Apollo and Dionysus, the two art deities of the Greeks, we come to recognize that in the Greek world there existed a tremendous opposition in origin and aims between the Apollonian art of sculpture and the non-imagistic Dionysian art of music. These two different tendencies run parallel to each other, for the most part openly at variance, and they continually incite each other to new and more powerful births, which perpetuate an antagonism only superficially reconciled by the common term art, till eventually, by a metaphysical miracle of the Hellenic will, they appear coupled with each other, and through this coupling ultimately generate an equally Dionysian and Apollonian form of art, Attic tragedy. Okay, so what he's setting up here between music and architecture, all the other art forms are between those two. Right, so sculpture, painting would be like moving from the architectural side, and then coming from the side of music, you get performative arts, and then the idea that Athens, that's what Attic means, Athenian tragedy as the sort of perfect middle ground between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, or between architecture and music. So I mentioned god of Apollo giving form to the world. Right, so that's what architecture does. Architecture is humans giving form to their world. Like architecture understood very broadly. So any way that we alter, produce our own space. So I think that, like landscape or what people now call the built environment, that would all be architecture in Nietzsche's terms. So that's on one side. On the other side is music. And we didn't cover this in the preface, the attempt at self-criticism. Of course, he looks back and he says, kind of how absurd that you could just call music Dionysian, because obviously music has form. Right, so in some ways, the Dionysian doesn't exist as art at all. And music is an art form, and so already has this Apollonian and Dionysian character to it. Part of it is the tendency of his argument that the rebirth of tragedy is in the form of Wagner. And Wagner, again, as a modernist, Wagner is a curious case with respect to music. Meaning, opera, the dramatic form of opera, a musical play, is that just music? It's kind of a mixed art form. Or it's not just music, it's drama plus music. And in fact, tragedy is drama. It's not an opera, it's drama. So the rebirth of tragedy that he associates with Wagner, if you guys know the term from Wagner, the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, so the total work of art. So Wagner was, of course, a maniac, so he exerted total control over the production of his works. So he was the librettist, the composer, he was the dramatist, the director. He did the set design, he did everything. And eventually he set up his own special space for producing his work, where people had to go to see his work. Because he needed that much control over all aspects of his productions. Right? So the total work of art. It's not just music, total work of art. So it's visual, it's dramatic, and it's auditory, it's sculptural, it's architectural, it's the whole thing. This first kind of determination of this relationship between the Apollonian and the Dionysian is dreams and intoxication. So dreams are about images, and because dreams are about images, they're the Apollonian dimension. Intoxication, on the other hand, is the Dionysian element. So an artwork, in Nietzsche's terms, is not only a dream, like a kind of dream image, but it's also an intoxication. And intoxication is, of course, what is that? It's like an experience, a pleasure one gets from something harmful. Right? That's why it's intoxication. So basically you take a little bit of poison in order not to die or get sick, but rather to have this intense experience.
Is that like a version of the sublime?
Sounds like it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does sound like it, doesn't it? Yes. Meaning, the pleasure that we get from intoxication comes from the toxic or harmful, poisonous, or potentially deadly character of what you're experiencing.
I know, like, dreams feels in many ways in line with intoxication as sort of a way to escape. Whether it's like literal sleeping dreams or just thinking of other realities that you're not actually experiencing.
Imagination. That's right. Yeah, so it does sort of raise that question, right? So he is tilting all of art in the direction, he's kind of overcompensating. He's tilting all of art in the direction of the Dionysian, right? Because even thinking of dreams in an entirely Apollonian sense would seem to not quite capture what gives dreams their power. That's right. But for purposes of his argument, let's consider. Time.
You're looking for Raphael.
Yes.
45.
Page 45 is the same page. Yeah, it's section. Yeah, it's section 3. Oh. All right. Recalling Kant for a second. Appearance, if you remember from the Robert Pippin, the first week of class. What do we need Kant for? Appearance. The phenomenal. The appearance. Here, Nietzsche addresses it as the appearance of appearance. Right, so if the phenomenal world, our everyday experience, our experience of nature, is about appearances. And Hegel last time said, can art be a worthy object of philosophy? Wouldn't nature be more appropriate? Well, no, because with art, we're aware of its deception, whereas with nature, we tend not to be aware of its deception. So how does Nietzsche deal with it here? Art is the appearance of appearance. In other words, what art allows us to consider is how appearances appear. The appearance of appearance. In his symbolic painting, Raphael, himself one of these immortal naive ones, has represented for us this demotion of appearance to the level of mere appearance, the primitive process of the naive artist and of Apollonian culture. If you recall Schiller, Naive and Sentimental Poetry, this is a supplemental reading for us, but I made mention of it, that the naive artist tries to be nature, whereas the sentimental artist points to nature and longs for nature. Right? Whereas the naive artist tries to be nature. In his Transfiguration, the lower half of the picture, with the possessed boy, the despairing bearers, the bewildered, terrified disciples, shows us the reflection of suffering, primal and eternal, the sole ground of the world. The mere appearance here is the reflection of eternal contradiction, the father of things. From this mere appearance arises, like ambrosial vapor, a new visionary world of mere appearances, invisible to those wrapped in the first appearance. A radiant floating in purest bliss, a serene contemplation beaming from wide open eyes. Here we have presented in the most sublime artistic symbolism that Apollonian world of beauty and its substratum, the terrible wisdom of sightliness, and intuitively we comprehend their necessary interdependence. Apollo, however, again appears to us as the apotheosis of the principium individuationis, in which alone is consummated the perpetually attained goal of the primal unity, its redemption through mere appearance. With his sublime gestures, he shows us how necessary is the entire world of suffering, that by means of it, the individual may be impelled to realize the redeeming vision and then sunk in contemplation of it, sit quietly in his tossing bark amid the waves. Okay, so the principium individuationis So this is Raphael's Transfiguration. I saw this painting in person. It's at the Vatican Museum of all places. Okay, so bottom half, top half. So we have two halves to this painting. So what's going on here? This is when Jesus is being taken up into heaven. So Jesus is becoming himself, the Christ, in transcending himself, right? So he's losing himself, he's transfiguring, he's being taken up into heaven, but in ceasing to be himself, he's becoming himself. The other figure is this boy, who's having a kind of epileptic fit, and who is also becoming himself by losing himself, meaning he's experiencing this horrific reality of human existence, namely bodily suffering to an extreme degree. And somehow, the epileptic fit and the assumption of Christ into heaven is like, they're related. They're kind of, is he reacting to this? So is this the truth of that, or is that the truth of this? Right? Because after all, why did Jesus exist? So that God could suffer as a human and thereby redeem human suffering. What does redeem human suffering mean? Just got to deal with Christian theology. It's forgiving humanity and lifting the punishment of original sin. Right? So Adam and Eve got expelled from paradise, expelled from the Garden of Eden for defying God, and then they suffered the punishment of sickness, mortality, biological reproduction, childbirth. Right? And that the punishment for original sin comes down to all humans from that point onward. And then God makes himself a human and suffers a horrible death, and in so doing forgives humanity of original sin and redeems the suffering of mankind. Right, it's the second covenant. Right, so it's a new relationship between God and humans, God and his creations. And that's what Jesus represents. So Raphael is a religious painter, but Renaissance painter, it's the emergence of humanism in art. Right, so the biblical allegory is being given a kind of incarnated experience. Right, so they're not just allegorical figures, they have the quality of real people. And in a sense, the most real figure is the boy suffering the epileptic fit. So, principium individuationis, the experience of the artwork. So let's talk about the experience of the artwork itself. Meaning, what is the viewer's aesthetic experience of this work? So, we don't identify with Jesus rising up to heaven. That's a bit much. Who do we identify with? We identify with the confused disciples, and they're pointing in different directions. They're saying that, and they're saying that. Right? The two truths that are connected and that appear to be opposites.
Wasn't epilepsy like they related it to something like genius, or I don't know, like they would say that like Julius Caesar had epilepsy. It would be like, oh, that's so great, that's so cool. Of course he does. Like,
You mean it's like a mark of greatness,
yeah.
that one should suffer that way? Yeah, yeah, and that is part of Nietzsche's point, right? In other words, this boy is marked out for special suffering in a way that Jesus himself had been marked out for special suffering, right? But Jesus himself marked out for special suffering because he's God become man, whereas this is just a boy. Right, so the distinction between the two is important, as well as the connection. Right, so it's humanism, but it's not like, what would Jesus do? It's not like that, direct identification. Mm-hmm.
But like, I feel like this kind of idealization of suffering means that we are being asked to kind of accept our conditions or not like push against them.
Maybe. Here, let me offer something in that regard. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but let me offer something. Because next week, Nietzsche's going to talk about socialism. So he's going to reject socialism. He doesn't know Marx. He doesn't know Marxism. Marxism hasn't really happened, and there's no reason for him to know Marx. He knows more famous socialists. And he basically says socialism is like what? Like socialism is like the last man instead of the overman. Meaning socialism is the sort of natural dead end of Christianity. So, in other words, it's the attempt to escape suffering. However, if socialism were something else, if socialism were the overcoming of capitalist suffering in order to go on to the better suffering, like the kind of transcend this suffering in order to achieve a new kind of suffering, then socialism could be the overman. Of course, he didn't know that aspect of socialism potentially. He only knew the aspect of it's like total triumph of philanthropy and sort of the charity and the sick, caring for the sick is what he's going to call it. So he just sees socialism as like the kind of terminus of nihilism as opposed to its potential overcoming. Right, so again, to accept our condition, that's a complicated idea. Right, so in some ways we could struggle against our suffering in a way that at a deeper level is just reconciling ourselves to it in the sense of not transcending it and discovering new ways to suffer, basically. Right, so it's the essential paradox. And of course, Jesus did not put an end to suffering. He did not. He only gave forgiveness, not an end to suffering. And in some ways, of course, he introduced a new way of suffering, the Christian way of suffering. Right, but again, for the purposes that he's raising it here, it's finding ourselves in suffering, losing ourselves in suffering. Right? The artwork is where we find ourselves, where our subjectivity is sort of constituted, and then it's also where our subjectivity is dissolved, transcended maybe, but dissolved. Meaning the boy loses himself. The experience of that kind of an epileptic fit is to lose oneself. And of course, that's different, but related to the way that Jesus ceased to be himself. It's a strange painting, actually. And that's why he turns to it. That's why he focuses on it. Because there seems to be a contradiction here, meaning it doesn't sort of neatly reconcile these two things. It does seem like very much a confrontation between these two realities. If we conceive of it all as imperative and mandatory, this apotheosis of individuation knows but one law, the individual, i.e. the delimiting of the boundaries of the individual, measure in the Hellenic sense. Apollo, as ethical deity, exacts measure of his disciples. And to be able to maintain it, he requires self-knowledge. And so, side by side with the aesthetic necessity for beauty, there occurs the demands, know thyself, and nothing in excess. So everything in moderation, everything in a measured way, nothing in excess. Consequently, overweening pride and excess are regarded as the truly hostile demons of the non-Apollonian sphere, hence as characteristics of the pre-Apollonian age, that of the Titans, and of the extra-Apollonian world, that of the barbarians. Okay, so he mentioned something that I want to come back to briefly, and then we'll take a break. The wisdom of Silenus. So who's Silenus? So Silenus is a satyr, meaning not a human, a kind of demigod. And the wisdom of Silenus. So what's the best condition for the human? The best.
To never have been born.
To never have been born. The best condition for the human is to never have been born. The second best, die quickly. Right? Now, of course, there wasn't ever such a being as the satyr, as Silenus, to say that. Right? So this is a story that humans made up about themselves. Meaning, what does it mean for humans to conclude or to be tormented by the thought that our best condition is to never be born and our second best condition is to die quickly, right? Why would we say that to ourselves? Yes, through the mouth of a demigod, but still, that's what we're telling ourselves. So again, we've been doing this thing, nihilism, and kind of wondering about the point and worth of our existence from the beginning. From the beginning. And again, originally in the form of religion. Pre-Apollonian religion. Pre-Apollonian religion. So meaning either external or prior, right? So either barbarians outside, he's using the term differently than we were using it with Schiller. He's using it in the ancient Greek sense, not in the Enlightenment sense. Or prior, meaning it's some kind of repressed past. Right? And that's where the Dionysian has been relegated already in ancient Athens. In ancient Athens, the Dionysian has already been kind of pushed into this remote past. Right, this kind of terrifying primordial condition that they had transcended. All right, let's take a short break. All right, so let me refer to my presenters, Yolanda and Stephanie. Who would like to guide us to some of your main points first?
Yeah, I'll start first. So, the tragedy is composed by Dr. Spirit and Lucy Spirit, and I just kind of elaborate on what each spirit is. So, should I just read or-
Yeah, I mean, you could also just sort of highlight the main points.
Okay, yeah, so, we proposed that I think kind of emphasize a lot on the individual will. And it said that like the dream is a huge part of it. And also in the arts is expressed as color, composition, lines, and such, so it's more of like the order aspect instead of like the most unique aspect compared to the others. And then so I mean I think the dream was created or the dream exists because the Greeks recognized that there's anything. So that's why they have this thought, this thing appearing. And then the recognition of anything at the end of the leads up to the values and spirit in order to kind of face the pain and just to know themselves. The values and spirit is the constitution and it appears when humans recognize something other than joy when you are knowing the spirit. And it's also the collapse of the executing minds. Along with the analogy of intoxication.
The principle of individuation. That's what how we would translate that in English. The principle of individuation.
Okay. Yeah, and music is its form. So that's kind of like the key point. And then
Let me say something. Can I interject here a bit? Okay, so yeah, so I forgot to mention Apollo is the god of dreams. Too. Right, so the god of form, also the god of dreams. So and dreams are the work of the imagination. So Apollo is the god of our imagination, or imagining, right, of our rendering our existence in the form of an image or in the form of appearances. Okay. So, at an individual level, right? So at the individual level, especially when thinking about either the artist or the viewer, right? Or the artist or the producer or the consumer. The artist or the viewer, the listener, the reader, etc. Okay, so individuation. Okay, so this is a very important point. So we are one. We are one, and yet we are many. We are one, meaning one species, one kind of existence, human existence, different from the animals, and yet we are many. Meaning there's an infinite diversity of human experience, but it's all human experience. So the collective and the individual. Collective and the individual. So the collective meaning how we experience things together. The individual, how do we experience things apart? So art is about both. Art is about both. Meaning the fact that it's art, that it isn't just the individual imagination, but that it's objectified, that it's externalized. Again, the appearance of appearance means that there's something inherently collective about it. So if we go back to the first week of class to Susan Buckmore's artist's work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Sustain, what does that mean? Sustain for others. Sustain for themselves, but also sustain for others. Meaning in objectifying or externalizing the individual's experience, the artist also makes it available to others. So there's something inherently collective about art. Right, so for art to be able to exist, this collective reality has to be part of it. So that's the tension. So it's one way of thinking about art, the experience of art, the making of art, but also the experience of art separates us from others and also connects us with others. Right, so we each have our own individual experience of art based on our imagination, based on our faculty of imagination. To each his own taste. Each person has their own experience of the world and therefore our works. However, in experiencing art, we also connect to others. So we separate ourselves from others and we connect to others through the art. So the same externalization, the same objectification, both separates us from others and connects us with others. So he associates Dionysian intoxication with religion, with religious ritual. And religious ritual is not only about connecting with other people, but also about connecting with the divine forces in nature. It means connecting with the gods or with God. So it's about losing ourselves not only as individuals in the collective of humanity, but also losing our humanity in the collective of the cosmos. Right, so it's about transcending our human existence, qua human. Now, we didn't talk about this much last time. Hegel, the introductory lectures on aesthetics, and he talked about different representations of God, different representations of the divine, different representations of the gods. And he said, when gods were beasts, it's because humans were beastly. So, again, religion is something that only humans do. The animals don't do religion. We do religion. It's quintessentially human. And yet it's also it's inherently about our connection with everything else. It's not just about our creation. It's about our connection with all of creation. With the cosmos, with the universe. So it's about finding ourselves, the meaning of human existence, but it's also about connecting that to a much larger reality. And in that sense, losing ourselves. So if art came out of religion, if the experience of art derives from religious experience, it has a similar character. So we are doing this kind of religious veneration, worship, submitting, and joining with, communing with the divine forces in art as we did in religion. So that's the intoxicating aspect. Because of course, in joining with the cosmos, we risk losing ourselves in the destructive sense too. So intoxicants are things that we find, like plants or animal toxins that we then use to bring ourselves to the brink of destroying ourselves. And we have mystical experiences that ancient peoples understood as religious experiences. So all drugs started out as religious devices. All drugs started out as things that people use to connect with the divine. Tobacco, alcohol, even cocaine and heroin, all started. Where did it start? When humans come to use these things, shrooms, everything, in religious ceremonies, religious rituals. Right, so in order to connect ourselves with the cosmos, we have to risk losing ourselves in the sense of risk destroying ourselves. Because anything that's intoxicating, the result can be death. Okay. He's connecting that with art. In other words, art causes us pain and not just pleasure. And so if we think back to Kant, the aesthetic, the pleasure of it, the pleasure that we take in the appearance of things, not in a physically gratifying way, but in a more aesthetic, cognitive way. Nietzsche is saying that's based on an Apollonian notion of art that neglects the Dionysian side of art, which is that art is not only some place we go for pleasure, it's some place we go for pain. And that's why this is about tragedy as an art form. There's a few things Nietzsche thinks is a more straightforward account of art that is suppressed, avoided by the Kantian aesthetics that we started off with, which is that people go to art for pain. People go to religion for pain. People go to religion for pain. Meaning, people go to religion to give their suffering meaning, but also to embrace their suffering as meaningful, to submit themselves to suffering that they wouldn't otherwise experience.
Isn't pain related to someone?
It is, right? So, it's not, I'm not saying that Kant, Nietzsche has a little bit of a polemical attitude towards Kant, so I'm sort of giving voice to that. But even so, like taking Nietzsche's perspective, he would say Kant already just reinterprets the pain of the sublime as pleasure and avoids the pain. So humans submit themselves to suffering that they wouldn't otherwise suffer as mere animals. In fact, they find new ways to suffer that they willfully, intentionally subject themselves to. And the first form of that is religion. The second form of that is art, and then we'll see philosophy. People also go to philosophy to subject themselves to suffering that they otherwise would not. Okay, so this is a core part of the Dionysian. Because the other thing is Nietzsche, this early Nietzsche, we'll get to the late Nietzsche. Even the late Nietzsche calls himself the Antichrist. He calls himself Dionysus. Right? So he still hangs on to this, even if he interprets it somewhat differently than we started out. Right. So again, the idea that humans don't just avoid suffering; they are attracted to suffering. They seek it out. They do it to themselves. They refine it. Right. So religion obviously has all sorts of rituals that are about that. Art too, though. Right, so it's clear that religion causes people to do things to make themselves suffer. But can we also admit that about art? Right, so he thinks we've lost sight of that. Right, with the Apollonian bias, we only see it as the dream world with images and forms that give us pleasure, and we lose sight of the fact that it's painful and that's the point. Right? It's so art makes us suffer. It gives form to suffering. So the Apollonian gives form, okay, we take pleasure or some kind of satisfaction in that form giving, but gives form to what? Gives form through suffering. That's why it's Apollonian and Dionysian. It's giving form to suffering, which is what makes suffering meaningful. Makes it apprehensible, makes it apparent, externalizes it, objectifies it, gives it a formal appearance. But what it is that's being given formal appearance is pain, is suffering. So there is part of him, of course, the other aspect of the polemic is that he's sort of the artist polemicizing against the philosopher. So part of the conceit here in Nietzsche is that all artists know this. It's only philosophers who don't know this. And then if artists try to understand their work by way of philosophy, they're going to lose touch with the truth that they already had, and that philosophy is taken away from them. Right? So it's very polemical. It's very much like artists ignore philosophy. They're just going to confuse you and make you lose sight of why you're doing what you're doing. Right, so later he's going to admit it's more complicated than that. But here it is very polemical. It is very much art against philosophy. The artist makes themselves suffer, gives that suffering meaning, and then the philosopher comes along and erases it. Turns it into a kind of, bourgeois craftsmanship and kind of making pretty things. That's it. Of its content. Right, so that's another way of thinking about it, form and content. The Apollonian form, Dionysian content. Right, so even in Aristotle's theory of tragedy, he's sort of saying, okay, how does tragedy work? How does this form operate? But he's sort of jumping over the essential part, which is its content. And then he sort of neutralizes it, banalizes it into a kind of psychology of like, oh, well, humans are mortal and they get sick and they suffer and they die. And so they need something as a palliative. They need something as a kind of therapy for that. Right, this is another core point. So I think that I mentioned this when we were doing Kant, but let's come back to it. Art. Art as art, capital A art, should be more than propaganda and entertainment. Did we talk about that? More than propaganda and entertainment, meaning it is propaganda and entertainment, meaning that is a religious origin as propaganda, like the Raphael painting, is religious propaganda, for sure. It's also entertainment. It has another source in the other ruling class, which is the court, the aristocracy, the divertissement, the pomp and circumstance. Folk art is both propaganda and entertainment in terms of the aesthetic reflex or rhythm form, the aesthetic form of the folk ways of existence of the common people. But art should be more than that. So it is that, but it should be more than that. Meaning, it should be art also. It should have artistic value in and of itself. There's a third thing that art needs to be more than. Art should be more than therapy. Right? So art is therapeutic, but it also should be more than therapy. Right? Meaning art is not just a mitigation or amelioration or consolation for suffering, but it's a heightening of suffering. It doesn't make us suffer less, it makes us suffer more. So art threatens to be merely propaganda and merely entertainment. It threatens to be merely therapy. And again, that's what the emphasis on pleasure would be. And also on consonance, just in musical terms. Right? Consonance, harmony, is Apollonian. Dissonance is Dionysian. dissonance is Dionysian, meaning dissonance is a core component of music. If you only understood music in terms of consonants, you'd lose more than half of what music is. Why do we listen to dissonant music? Because it's painful. That's the point. Because we do.
Or it reflects.
That's right. That would be a little Aristotelian in there. Like that we're giving form to suffering and therefore purging ourselves of it. And it's like, no, we're not just trying to eliminate it, right?
It's reveling.
Yes. We're kind of embracing it, we're kind of owning it, we're recognizing it as core to ourselves. So, the kind of Apollonian image that we have of the Greeks, right? We have these white buildings, white statues, we have these sort of very placid, pacified images, objects, beauty. But we don't know what Greek music was. We don't know what ancient Greek music sounded like. And that's part of his point. So we have these images of Greek aesthetics, but we don't have the sound of Greek aesthetics. Right? So he imagines that there was this whole, like, Wagnerian dissonant, like metal rock soundtrack to Greece that we've suppressed. The Dionysian. Right? Because even our image of tragedy is that it ties everything up in a bow. And it's sort of resolved. Right? Whereas the point is the conflict, the suffering, the clashing, right? We forget that it's about the gods like hating the humans and tormenting them, and humans fighting against the gods and losing. Right? That's also what art is. Right? Art is not a record of the triumph over the gods, or triumph over tragedy, triumph over fate. It's about succumbing, the losing, suffering, destruction. We read that little Baudelaire. Did we read the Baudelaire about the art is a duel in which the artist shrieks with horror before succumbing? I think we did. The Paris Queen? No? We did? We did. Yeah. Paris Queen. So, the opposite of the Kantian idea, right? So the Kantian idea is that it's a sympathetic resonance of subject and object. The Baudelairean idea is that it's a duel. Like the artist making art is a duel in which beauty prevails by defeating the artist, and the artist shrieking in terror, losing the fight, losing the duel. That's metal. That's like Nietzsche. That's like Dionysus. Every work of art is not some achievement of form over suffering. Every work of art is the succumbing of the artist to suffering. Also.
Isn't that a little bit Hegelian here?
Yes.
That the ability to master form is useless without the willingness to succumb.
So what does Nietzsche, we're going to deal with Nietzsche's brief against Hegel. We don't have it very much here. We'll have it more in the subsequent readings. So he has some respect for Hegel, but he thinks that Hegel resolves the contradiction, reconciles, and what Nietzsche's interested in is the contradictory character of contradiction, meaning Nietzsche wants to preserve the contradiction, not reconcile it. And it's a one-sided reading of Hegel, it is. And it's more of a rancor against the right Hegelians than against like Hegel, and certainly against the left Hegelians. So, there are these sort of two souls to Hegel, we could say. There's, Hegel who, again, embraces conflict and, destruction and, pain and suffering, the slaughter bench of history. And then there's the Hegel that's like, and it all works out in the end, right? And Nietzsche's like, yeah, let's skip that part because it doesn't all work out in the end. Meaning all that we do is move on to the next form of suffering. That's necessary as well, though, right? And again, there is one soul of Hegel that would not disagree with that at all, but that's the part that Nietzsche is going with, and that's the part that Nietzsche thinks is being suppressed.
This is reminding me of something interesting that he says about Kant, which is that Kant helps inaugurate a tragic culture, but prioritizing wisdom over science or something like that. So would you think that like Hegel, in resolving the Kantian contradiction, is taking that step backwards?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. In a nutshell, yes. Absolutely, yes. Meaning Kant embodies a contradiction that Hegel tries to resolve in his view, in Nietzsche's view. Now, whether that's accurate to Hegel, it's not really. But it is the, so Kant is seen as antinomical, and Hegel is seen as dialectical, and dialectical is understood, mistakenly understood, as resolving the antinomy, resolving the contradiction. So Nietzsche's point is that we're never going to resolve the contradiction. We can change its form, but it's never going to be resolved. It's never going to go away. Right, so that's also Hegel. Hegel also thinks that. But, that's what people forget.
But wouldn't Hegel, so not to go on what you're saying, but wouldn't Hegel agree with that because he's more of like talking about art from an external, like it's more of a critique of art from an external perspective on the course of how we experience the content of it versus Nietzsche is an artist himself.
That would be Nietzsche's suspicion. Nietzsche's suspicion is that, of course, Hegel's a philosopher and therefore he's theoretical man,
Yeah.
whereas Nietzsche is artist. And the irony is Nietzsche's a philosopher. He is. So next week we'll deal with the fact that he is like, okay, I'm a philosopher, bitch. Okay, fine. Like, fuck it. But then it's like, and that means that I am able to critique philosophy because I am a philosopher, right? So, yeah. But indeed, there is this question of the dialectic. Meaning, does the dialectic exacerbate the contradiction or does it resolve it? And that even in resolving it, you might be deepening it, not escaping it. So again, but art in this way embodies this in a way that philosophy can't, because philosophy just sort of mentally reconciles us, because it sort of resolves it in thought, gives it a thought form.
I don't have to say highlight the things I wrote here. I feel like favorite piece is the letter that kind of finished Rich Hardy to as leadership diversity. Spirit was replaced by some Socratic ideas, which I feel like Socratic emphasizes the logic more than the some like suspense elements that could exist in the writings. And in other words, Socrates' desire to be sober, which is against the kind of intoxication,
Yep.
always exists in the like explanation of reality of the person and modernism. Somehow like pointing out the levers of activity between different philosophy and music. And then he also mentioned the levers of spectators, which at that time a lot of the spectators of the play is being like intoxicated by a critique in which the actress like is treated what's being the core of tragedy. Like I feel like the actors were trying to please the spectators with a lot of like critique elements where they're viewing the plays, but like not really like having some aesthetic development while they're reviewing the plays. And I mean, it's like the what we had mentioned in the class about the dimension of
Right. Right. So, what he brings it around to in terms of the rebirth of tragedy is that by being biased in favor of the Apollonian itself loses its actual power, and so that only by way of the Dionysian can the Apollonian actually be itself. Right, so now, music, he thinks, is the prime example of the deficit of a purely Apollonian view of art, because then it loses the meaning, the pathos, the purpose of the musical form itself. Now, what makes Wagner, we'll end on this then, what made Wagner a modernist? He really did violate the form of music. He did. We had a little bit of an example of it with the His Old as Leaves Took. So the unchained melody, right, the sort of endless flowing, right, which seems to violate formal structure and the sonata form, for example, the sort of exposition, musical exposition, which has more of a logical structure to it. And we're going to see he's going to sort of flip on this a little bit, but not entirely. So here he's saying that Wagner is sort of turning music against itself by kind of bursting the bounds of what gives form to music. But at the same time, he's creating a much more complex form. And so he's actually restoring the formal power of music by doing that. So, music is the attempt to give form to something that cannot be given form. And yet, music had itself kind of abdicated on that mission or task or purpose by becoming too formal. Now, classical, like we have classicism, right, and generally we're using that in this kind of broad sense since the Renaissance, but there's also classical music. So I mentioned the 25 years of philosophy from Kant to Hegel. Classical music, classical tonality, Mozart to Beethoven. Right? The classical is a very discrete period of musical history. That basically, Mozart to Beethoven captures entirely. And then Romanticism, which Beethoven sort of bridges between classicism and Romanticism, itself suffers from what Hegel was talking about, meaning it's music that is unable to sort of embody the aesthetic experience, but rather suggests an experience that music can't provide. Whereas Wagner, coming out of Romanticism, what makes Wagner a modernist is that it's able to take place within music again. Right, so it's not a kind of suggestion of a feeling, but the music is sort of intimating but never actually embodying. There's a radicalization of music in Wagner that again brings us to the threshold of what can make sense musically, but still actually does make sense. Right, so it's not that he's against Mozart and Beethoven, not exactly. But still, if one were to just leave music at that point, which was impossible, meaning we've moved on, then one would subject music to this Apollonian bias. Right, so, and can I say something about classical music, classical tonality? Isn't it based on science? Based on natural harmonic science? So music was practiced for thousands of years. How come no one ever, in those thousands of years, ever thought of using natural harmonics as the basis for music? It's not as if people didn't know it. Like, of course people knew natural harmonics. But that was considered unartistic. To just make music out of natural harmonics would have been boring, uninteresting, not really artistic. So the triumph of the classical tonality is also a kind of strange kind of self-terminus of music. And so it's the sort of highest achievement of music as an art form, but it also is the kind of vitiating of what makes music as an art form. And again, Romanticism sort of struggles out of that cul-de-sac, but then Wagner, in his view, actually breaks out of it. Now we'll see, he thinks, well, maybe I was wrong about that. Maybe Wagner didn't actually break out of that cul-de-sac, but he just diverted us into another place that actually abdicates on music in another way. But that's the reference point. The reference point is what makes the classical classical. So before the classical was like Rococo, Baroque, and basically we find it charming, we find it interesting, but it seems like antiquated, it seems a little weird, like it seems idiomatic, it seems like more cultural, it doesn't seem like aesthetic form, like free, it seems like totally steeped in sort of custom and tradition. Whereas with Mozart, from Mozart to Beethoven, it seems like music becomes itself. And again, the paradox being that it becomes itself by kind of abdicating itself, by trying to make music entirely out of natural harmonics that no one had ever done before for thousands of years, and that can't last, like immediately goes into crisis with romanticism. But we'll get there. Right, but this is also his way of making sense of that. In other words, a triumph of pure form in music is the end of music as an art form, because it means eliminating the Dionysian element, or at least seems to. Again, he's going to revise this idea, but this argument that he's making here has to do with that. All right. See you guys next week.